The sun hung low in the sky as Mariah Thompson steered her car down Maplewood Drive. It was just past 5 o'clock, and the light dipped warm and gold across her dashboard. She had spent the day visiting schools in her district, talking with cafeteria workers about healthy meals for students. Now, she was tired, but happy. She smiled at a memory of little faces lighting up over fresh fruit cups. She glanced at the rearview mirror and saw her own eyes, bright, but a little weary. Framed by tired lines that spoke of long days and hard work, she eased her foot off the gas and drifted under a speed limit sign. She felt safe in her old sedan, a reliable friend through countless miles of community roads. She thought about cooking dinner for her daughter, Emma, who would be waiting at home with a plate of homework spread out on the kitchen table. Mariah pictured Emma's hopeful grin as she told her about the day's news, how the school lunch program was growing stronger, how children were getting better meals, and how each small change might spark a healthier future. A sudden flash of red and blue lights startled Mariah. She blinked, confused for a moment, then realized she was being pulled over. Her heart fluttered hard in her chest. She eased her car to the curb and rolled down her window. "Good evening, officer," said her voice, steady but polite. Officer Rodriguez, tall and broad-shouldered, peered inside with a questioning look. His partner, Officer Mills, stood a few feet behind, arms folded across his chest. The officers wore dark uniforms and shiny badges, the law's quiet symbols of authority. Mariah gave them her driver's license and registration, hands reaching calmly into her purse. She felt a curious tension in the air, as if the night itself held its breath. Rodriguez scanned her license, then frowned. "Expired registration," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. He looked back at her eyes, studied her face for a long moment. "Ma'am, do you know your registration has been invalid for 2 months?" Mariah nodded. She tried to keep her tone gentle. "Yes, officer, I know. I've been meaning to renew it. It slipped my mind with so many meetings at the Capitol. I'll take care of it first thing tomorrow." Rodriguez glanced at Mills and shrugged. He folded the papers and stepped closer to the car. "I'm going to have to ask you to step out. And give me your ID again? We'll run your name through the system." Mariah's pulse quickened. She noticed the crisp night air brushing her arms, the soft hum of distant traffic. She did as she was told, opening her door and sliding onto the pavement. Her shoes clicked lightly on the asphalt. She raised her hand slightly just to show she carried nothing hidden. "Of course, officer." Mills moved forward and placed a firm hand on her arm. Mariah froze, surprised. "Please, officer," she said. "I'm not resisting. Oh, stand still." But Mills already had the handcuffs out, and in a swift motion, clicked them around Mariah's wrists. The metal bit cold against her skin. Her heart pounded a frantic tattoo in her chest. She breathed in slowly, reminding herself to stay calm, to be respectful. She was a public servant, a woman of law and order. She would not give them a reason to treat her unfairly. Rodriguez stepped closer, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "Funny how you talk smooth, but you don't look so law-abiding." He snickered. "You're up to something," Mariah swallowed. The words cut like wind-blown sand. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to give him more fuel. She felt the weight of the cuffs, their hard circle reminding her that in that moment, she was powerless in his hands. They guided her to the back of the squad car. Mariah's mind raced. She thought of Emma waiting for her, of dinner growing cold on the stove. She thought of schoolchildren who counted on her voice in Congress to make their lives better. She thought, too, about the spectators on the street neighbors. Who would see a black woman in handcuffs and jump to conclusions? The officers lifted her gently but firmly and helped her into the back seat. She sat on the vinyl, feeling its thin, cool layer against her skirt. They closed the door with a clunk that echoed off nearby houses. Then Rodriguez walked around to the driver's side and climbed in. The car roared to life and pulled away. Braced herself against the immediate jolt. Through the small window, she saw Mills climb into the passenger seat, his eyes flicking to her with brazen amusement. She settled her breathing, counting slowly in her mind. 1, 2, 3. She watched streetlights pass by in streaks of yellow. The sky above was a deepening blue, sprinkled with the first brave stars of evening. She listened to the engine's steady hum, the whisper of tires on pavement. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought of her mother, who had taught her early to face hard moments with unshakable calm. She summoned that memory like a warm blanket around her heart. At the precinct, the officers led her off the car and into a brightly lit hallway. The smell of cleaning solution and stale coffee met her nose. A security guard nodded them through. Doubled doors. Mariah kept her head high, chin level, but inside she felt the sting of every curious glance they passed. They brought her into an interrogation room. Harsh fluorescent bulbs made the small space feel stark. A metal table stood at the center, 2 chairs opposite each other. They guided her roughly into one chair, the metal legs scraping on the floor. She resettled, straightening her blouse, smoothing her hair. Rodriguez leaned across the table. He folded his arms and gave her a cold smile. "Tell me again why your registration expired." Mariah spoke softly. "Sir, like I said, I've been busy with my work in Washington. I should have taken care of it sooner, but it slipped by. I'll renew it first thing in the morning." Mills laughed from behind Rodriguez. "You talk all fancy, Congresswoman, or whatever you are. Doesn't change the fact you broke the law." Mariah's chest tightened. She glanced at the 2 officers. They exchanged jokes about sneaky types and city slickers, their voices low, but full of derision. She felt the meaning behind each word. She was black. She was a woman in power. They thought that made her suspicious, a target for mockery. She breathed in through her nose, holding the air for a beat before exhaling slowly. She pictured Emma's face again, her small brown eyes looking up with trust. She pictured the faces of children at school, waiting for someone to speak up for them. She reminded herself she carried a bigger purpose than this cramped room. These mocking voices. The officers continued to jab. They pointed at her ID and registration, joked about getting special treatment, about finding out what kind of racket she runs. But Mariah stayed silent. She refused to answer their bait. She knew that any slip of anger or fear could be used against her. After a moment, Rodriguez glanced at his watch. He turned away, calling for someone off camera. "I'll be right back," he said. The door clicked behind him, and Mills followed, leaving Mariah alone. She sat in the quiet room, cuffs clicking when she shifted her hands. She stared at the scratched tabletop, noticing dust and small cracks. She willed herself to focus on something ordinary. She looked at the faded paint on the walls, the single fluorescent bulb overhead. She let the ordinariness of the space calm her. Outside the room, she heard voices, whispers, footsteps, a distant door opening. She braced herself again. She felt both fear and a quiet resolve settle in her chest. For a moment, a single thought came through her mind as clear as a bell. "I will not let this break me." She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. She pictured home, the warm kitchen, Emma's laughter. She pictured the faces of the school lunch workers, smiling as she promised to keep fighting for better meals. She pictured the parents who counted on her voice, seniors who told her stories about their youth, trusting her to carry their hopes forward. When the door clicked open again, Mariah lifted her head, she straightened her spine, took another breath, and prepared to face whatever came next. Mariah sat in the bright room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The small table in front of her felt cold and hard against her knees. She shifted in the chair, the handcuffs around her wrists clicking softly as she moved. Across from her, Officer Rodriguez leaned back in his own chair, folding his arms across his chest. Officer Mills stood nearby, one foot propped on the wall. Watching Mariah with a smirk, Rodriguez tapped his pen on the desk, rhythmically as if composing a tune in his head. He glanced at Mariah's file one more time. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes with a forced smile. "So, Congresswoman Thompson," he began, using her title like a challenge, "we're working Washington, right? Talking about school lunches and healthy snacks?" Mariah held her breath for a moment. She thought of her work heartfelt talks with cafeteria cooks, visiting low-income neighborhoods, pushing for fresh fruit over sugary desserts. She closed her eyes briefly and answered calmly, "Yes, I care about children's health. I believe every student deserves good food. Mills let out a low chuckle. He leaned forward, resting both elbows on the table. Right, he said slowly. Good food. But what about the kind of food they serve in here? He gestured around the sterile room, implying jails and confinement. He tilted his head and added, You ever heard of justice? Ever think about that? Mariah opened her eyes. She felt her pulse quicken. She had not expected this line of mockery. Officer, she said softly, I believe in fair treatment and equal justice. That's why I wrote several bills. Rodriguez cut her off with a laugh. Bills, 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 he said, waving his hand dismissively. You know what we have plenty of around here? Laws, and you broke one. Registration expired? That's on you. Mills burst out laughing, slapping his thigh. She's up there talking about laws and bills, he said, voice loud enough so others in the station could hear. But she forgot her own registration. How funny is that? Mariah bowed her head, fighting the urge to raise her voice. She remembered her mother's advice. Keep your calm, Maria. Stay above their noise. She breathed in and out, steadying herself. Then she looked up and spoke in a clear voice. I understand my mistake, officer. I'm ready to fix it tomorrow. They ignored her answer. Mills climbed onto the table, settling into a casual squat. He crossed his arms and stared at Mariah. You look different on TV, he said, eyebrows raised. On TV, you're all neat and polished. Here you look, he made a dismissive wave. Normal. You blend in with everyone else. Rodriguez nodded, grinning. Yeah, you think you're special up there? But here, you're just another person. Mariah felt the room close in around her. She thought of the women she met who labored in offices, driveways, and factories, the women who carried duties no one noticed and made no big speeches about it. She thought of the strength it took for them to keep going. She thought of Emma. Waiting for her at home, with homework and a hug, she lifted her chin. I may look like anyone else, officer, she said gently, but I believe in standing up for people. I believe in service. I respect the law. Rodriguez scoffed and nudged Mills. They both laughed again. Mills stood up and walked to the door. He called out, Haley! A figure appeared behind the glass of the one-way mirror. Officer Lee, the dispatcher, stepped inside. She was young, with kind eyes and a soft expression. She carried a clipboard, her uniform crisp and neat. Lee looked between Mariah and the officers. She cleared her throat. Ma'am, do you need anything? She asked Mariah politely, then she glanced at Rodriguez and Mills. Officers, can I see the report? Rodriguez glared at Lee. Just handle the paperwork, Lee, he snapped. We're conducting an interview. Lee's eyes flicked back to Mariah. There was something in her gaze, empathy, but she kept her tone professional. Yes, sir, she said, and turned to leave. As Lee exited, Mills muttered under his breath, loud enough for Mariah to hear, Wonder if she'd be so calm if she was some other type of lady. Rodriguez jabbed him in the ribs. Don't get too loud, he whispered. Then he leaned forward, chin resting on his hand. You ever wonder why we react this way when you show up in a car? Why we feel the need to cuff first and ask later? Mariah paused before answering. She thought of why she had fought for fair policing reforms. Why she had heard so many stories from her constituents about unfair stops and rough treatment. She thought of her own community, the fear of seeing flashing lights in the rearview mirror, the anxiety in the pit of the stomach. She spoke softly, choosing her words. When I see flashing lights behind me, she said, I feel fear too. Fear of not being treated with respect. Fear of being judged before being heard. That fear is real for many people. Rodriguez snorted. Your fear isn't our problem, he said. You're special. You're in Congress. You can talk big words. But down here in the real world, we do our job. We see someone with expired papers. We stop them. Doesn't matter who they are. Mills nodded. He leaned close enough that Mariah could see the freckles on his face. Here's a question, he said. What? Do you think this would happen if you were white? Mariah looked at him. She saw his curiosity mixed with sarcasm. She swallowed. I think it might be different, she said. Because bias is real. People see color first, not a person's heart or work. Oh, many studies show that Rodriguez waved his hand. Studies. Give me a break. He even rolled his eyes to the ceiling. This is real life, Congresswoman. Real life. Mariah felt. Her chest tightened again, but she found her voice. Real life matters, she said, so do real lives. Even those who offend you, even those you think are making mistakes, they deserve respect, a fair chance to speak, and a chance to be heard. The officer stared at her for a moment, and Mills shrugged and sat back on the table. He wiggled his eyebrows as if to say, whatever. Rodriguez tapped his pen twice and pushed back his chair. Rodriguez stood and began to write notes in Mariah's file. He wrote so deliberately that she could almost see each letter. She watched his hand, the ink scratching on the paper. She held her breath, wondering what he would say in his report. After a minute, he put down his pen and looked at Mariah. You'll be released soon, he said. But remember, the law applies to everyone. Let this be a lesson. Mariah nodded. Thank you, she said, her voice steady. I've learned mine. Rodriguez and Mills left the room together. The door clicked behind them. Mariah was alone now. The room felt even colder, the silence pressing against her ears. Her wrists, where the cuffs had left slight red marks. She closed her eyes and let herself rest for a moment. She thought of Emma's laughter. She thought of the school cook smiling when she visited. She thought of children running in playgrounds and grandparents, reading stories to their grandchildren. A soft knock sounded at the door. Officer Lee slipped in, carrying a cup of water and a smile. She placed the cup on the table. Here, she said quietly, you look like you could use this. Mariah smiled at Lee, a real smile this time. Thank you, she said, and took a sip. The water was cool and refreshing. She felt a spark of gratitude for this small kindness. Lee paused near the door. She looked at Mariah's face and then back at the door. Mariah nodded gently. Lee closed the door behind her, leaving Mariah alone with the cup and her thoughts. Mariah sat back and held the cup in both hands. She let the warmth fill her. She whispered to herself, this ends soon. She pictured the moment her handcuffs would be removed, the moment she could leave this room and tell her story. She pictured her own office, with sunlight streaming through the windows and her daughter waiting for her. She set the cup down and leaned forward, pressing her elbows on the table and resting her head in her hands for just a moment. She allowed herself to feel the anger, the frustration, and then let it go. She took another deep breath, letting calm wash over her once more. When she lifted her head, her eyes were clear. She sat upright, ready for whatever came next. She knew this day would become more than just an incident. It would become a chance to show how bias could hurt and how kindness could heal. She tightened her grip on the edge of the table and waited. Lieutenant Parker stepped into the interview room carrying a manila folder. The door clicked shut, and a hush fell over the room as Mariah lifted her head. Her wrists still bore the faint marks of the handcuffs, but her posture remained calm and steady. Officer Rodriguez looked up from his seat, pen in hand, and offered a tight smile. Officer Mills straightened from where he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Parker paused in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the scene. He wore a crisp uniform, a silver badge shining on his chest. His face was serious, but not unkind. He cleared his throat and said, I'm Lieutenant Parker. I need to review this case. He placed the folder on the small table and opened it. Scanning the documents inside, Mariah watched him, curiosity mixed with relief. After the mocking and the waiting, she hoped this would finally clear the air. She met Parker's eyes and offered a small nod. Rodriguez leaned forward, pointing at Mariah's registration form. Lieutenant, she had expired papers. We cuffed her until we could verify her ID and run her name. Parker flipped a page and frowned. Expired registration, he repeated softly. Then he checked the next sheet. His brows lifted, and his breath caught. He glanced back at Rodriguez. Is this? His voice trailed off. Rodriguez blinked. Mills straightened further. Parker tapped the paper again. The room grew still. The only sound, the faint hum of the overhead light. Parker closed the folder. Slowly, he looked at Mariah. You're Congresswoman Mariah Thompson, he said as if speaking to himself. His eyes widened. From the House of Representatives? Mariah nodded once. No. Her heart beat faster. She felt the knot in her chest loosen just a bit. Rodriguez's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mills stared at the table, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Parker took a breath and folded his hands. "Officers," he said quietly but firmly, "Ms. Thompson is a member of the United States Congress." He glanced at Rodriguez's notes. "She is a public servant. We need to handle this correctly." Rodriguez swallowed hard. He looked at Mariah, guilt flickering in his eyes. Mills shifted his gaze toward the floor. Parker cleared his throat again. "Release her handcuffs immediately." He stood and motioned toward the door. "Please step outside. I will handle the rest." Rodriguez and Mills exchanged a quick look. Then, without a word, they moved to unlock the cuffs. The cold metal fell away, and Mariah rubbed her wrists, flexing her fingers. She stayed seated. Watching each movement, once the cuffs were removed, Rodriguez and Mills rose and ducked their heads. They opened the door and slipped into the hallway. The door clicked softly behind them. Mariah sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. She took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Her pulse had been racing, but now it steadied. She thought of Emma, of the children she fought for, and of the work still to be done. Lieutenant Parker closed the folder and placed it on the table. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper and laid it beside Mariah's file. "I apologize for this misunderstanding," he said, voice gentle. "We will correct the report. You will not have any charges filed." Mariah offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant." Parker nodded and pulled out a chair, sitting across from her. "I want to hear your side," he said. "Please tell me what happened from your perspective." Mariah sat forward, hands resting lightly on the table. She spoke in a calm, clear voice. She described how she had been pulled over for expired registration, how she had complied with every request, and how the officers had mocked her-made jokes about her speech, her work. And the fact that she was black. She told him about the fear that tightened her chest when she saw the handcuffs, and about how she remembered her purpose and stayed calm. Parker listened intently, eyes never leaving hers. He nodded occasionally, making brief notes. When Mariah finished, he folded his hands and looked at her thoughtfully. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "This is not how we should treat anyone. Your experience shows we have work to do, especially in how we handle stops and treat people with respect." Mariah nodded. "I understand the pressures officers face," she said. "Traffic stops can be difficult and risky, but respect and fairness should guide every action." Parker leaned back and ran his hand through his hair. "Agreed," said, "and I want to make sure this leads to change, not just an apology. I will speak with the department leadership to review our procedures, especially around identification stops. We need to ensure respect for all, regardless of position, race, or background." Mariah felt relief and hope. She thought of the conversation. She planned with community leaders. She thought of the bills she was working on in Congress about policing reforms. She felt that this moment could make a difference beyond her own case. Lieutenant Parker reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you are willing, I would appreciate your input. We are setting up a committee to review stop and identification procedures. Your voice would be valuable." Mariah accepted the card and held it carefully. "I would be glad to help," she said. Parker stood and folded the committee papers, carried them out of the room, and returned a moment later with another officer. Officer Lee, the dispatcher who had shown kindness earlier. Lee offered Mariah a clear cup of water and a gentle smile. "You did well," Lee whispered quietly. "Thank you for staying calm." Mariah took the water gratefully and nodded. "Thank you, Officer Lee." Lee stepped back and nodded toward Parker. "All set," she said. Parker approached Mariah. "We're going to walk you out," he said, "and make sure we clear you from any record of arrest." Mariah stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. She felt the tension leave her shoulders, replaced by a quiet dignity. She met Parker's eyes. "Thank you," she said again, "for listening and acting." Parker nodded. "Thank you for speaking up. It matters." They walked out of the interview room together. The hallway seemed brighter now, as though the overhead light shone with clarity instead of glare. Mariah felt each step solid beneath her feet. They passed other officers at desks who paused to look. Some offered nods of respect. Others averted their eyes. Parker led her to the main desk. He spoke quietly with the sergeant in charge. A few explaining words, a couple of nods, and then the sergeant saluted Mariah. "Congresswoman," he said, "the station is at your disposal, ma'am." Mariah nodded and offered a polite smile. She looked at the officers at the desk, then at the small crowd of staff. She realized how quickly a tense situation could change when someone chose to do the right thing. She felt gratitude and hope. Parker escorted her to the exit. The front door opened onto the cool evening air. Mariah stepped out, breathing deeply, tasting freedom. The sun was nearly gone, but the sky held a soft glow of twilight. Cars passed by on the street, unaware of the drama that had unfolded behind. The precinct walls, before she left, Parker turned to her. "I will send you a summary of our review," he said. "I look forward to working with you on policy changes." Mariah nodded. "I look forward to it too," she said. "You, Lieutenant." They shook hands and Parker turned away. Mariah walked to her car with confident strides. She paused at the driver's side, looked back at the building, and climbed in. She sat in the driver's seat a moment, reflecting on the journey from mocking words to respectful change. She started the engine, and as she drove away, she felt a new sense of purpose. Tonight, she had been more than a defendant, she had been a catalyst for understanding. And tomorrow, she would use her voice in Congress to make sure that no one else felt powerless under flashing lights. Mariah returned home under a sky brushed with purple and pink. The evening air was calm, and her front porch light greeted her like an old friend. She paused at the door, taking a moment to steady her thoughts. Behind her, the night held both the memory of humiliation and the promise of change. Ahead, her quiet house held warmth and safety. Inside, Emma looked up from the kitchen table. Textbooks were scattered around her, and colored pencils lay idle. When she saw Mariah walk through the door, relief washed over her young face. I think she set aside her work and ran forward. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, her voice both excited and worried. Mariah knelt and wrapped her arms around Emma. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said softly. "Just a long day." She smelled the faint scent of oregano drifting from a pot on the stove. Dinner gently simmered, ready for simple plates and warm conversation. Emma guided her to the table. They sat together, plates between them. Mariah spooned up vegetables and rice. The simple meal felt like comfort. "Tell me about your day," Emma said, lifting her glass of water. "You were gone so long." Mariah smiled and took a breath. She thought of how to share just enough without causing worry. "I had meetings at the Capitol," she began. "I spoke about school lunches and healthy meals. Then on my way home, I got stopped by police." Emma paused, mid-bite. Stopped. "Why?" She asked. Mariah paused too, choosing her words with care. "My car registration was expired. The officers decided to handcuff me and take me in. They made jokes about me, about my work, even about the color of my skin." Emma's fork clattered. Onto her plate, "They did not," she said, eyes wide. "They did," Mariah said. She reached across the table, holding Emma's small hand. "But then they realized who I am." She watched as Emma's eyebrows lifted. "I'm a member of Congress," she continued. "They were surprised, and then they treated me with respect." Emma nodded slowly. "That must have been scary." She said it was. Mariah admitted, "But I stayed calm. I remembered why I do this work. I refuse to let fear or anger control me." Emma squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Mariah's chest warmed. "Thank you," she said. She looked around the cozy kitchen. Emma's homework, the family photos on the wall, the gentle hum of the stove. "How was school today?" she asked, changing the subject gently. As Emma told her about a fun science experiment and a new story she was writing, Mariah listened and savored these simple moments. She knew this peace was fragile, a balance between public life and private love. But tonight it felt strong. By the time dishes were cleared, the house had grown quiet. Emma climbed the stairs to her room, humming a soft tune. Mariah washed the last plate, her mind drifting between what had happened and what must be done next. She dried her hands on a towel and sat at her desk. The lamp glowed softly over stacks of papers, bills to review, letters from constituents, notes for upcoming meetings. On top of the pile lay Lieutenant Parker's business card. Mariah reached for it, feeling its smooth edges. She remembered how Parker had offered to work with her on policy changes. She felt hope stir. She opened her laptop and drafted an email. A thank you to Parker for listening, offer to share ideas on improving police procedures, and a request to set up a meeting. She paused before hitting send. This was not just about her story. It was about every person who ever felt powerless under flashing lights after sending the message. Mariah leaned back and closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of this moment. Single traffic stop, a moment of fear and injustice, had sparked a promise of reform. She thought of the news reports already emerging, headlines like Congresswoman's arrest sparks debate on policing, practices, and officer bias under scrutiny. She knew that public reaction would be mixed. Some would say she had an unfair advantage. Others would welcome the call for change. She rose and moved to the living room. The couch was soft and inviting. She sank in and stared at the muted glow of the television, where a talk show replayed commentary on her incident. Experts argued about bias, procedure, and privilege. Mariah listened, her mind active. She noted the questions people asked. How often do minor infractions lead to such treatment? What training do officers receive on bias and respect? How can communities and police work together? She closed her laptop and picked up a notebook from the coffee table. On the first page, she wrote, 1. Mandatory bias training for all officers. 2. Clear guidelines for nonviolent traffic stops. 3. Body cameras always on. 4. Community oversight panels. 5. Clear communication protocols. Each point felt like a seed of progress. Night deepened outside. The house was still. Mariah glanced. At the clock nearly midnight, she rubbed her eyes and flipped on a lamp by the couch. She opened the notebook again and added a note. Meet Parker, discuss pilot program in my district. She set the notebook aside and reached for her phone. She texted her chief of staff. Need briefing on local precinct policies? Meet tomorrow morning. Then she texted her friend on the police reform committee. Good news, Parker wants to talk. I'm drafting proposals now. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with replies, enthusiastic cheers. Offers of support, questions about details. Mariah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling both tired and energized. She thought back to the precinct room, its harsh lights, the cold table, the mocking voices. She thought of Officer Lee, who had silently shown kindness. She thought of the power of one person to choose respect over judgment, and how that choice could ripple outward. She rose and walked to the window. Through the glass, she saw the quiet street, lined with trees and darkened homes. A single porch light glowed across the road. She imagined those neighbors, people with their own lives and stories passing by, unaware of the day's events. Yet their lives connected with hers in that moment. She felt a deep sense of responsibility. Taking a deep breath, Mariah whispered, "This is just the beginning." She returned to her desk, turned on the lamp, and began drafting a public statement. She wrote in simple, clear language, "Today, I experienced firsthand what many Americans face every day. I was stopped for a minor infraction and treated with undue suspicion. While I was lucky to be in a position where my status could correct that injustice, millions are not so fortunate. We must build a system of policing grounded in respect and fairness for all." She paused, reading the words. They felt honest and true. After refining the statement, she scheduled it to post on her website and social media channels at dawn. She knew the morning would bring attention, questions, and perhaps criticism. But she also knew that silence would be worse. She closed her laptop and blew out the desk lamp. Back on the couch, Mariah sat for a moment, hands folded in her lap. She allowed herself a small smile, thinking of Emma sleeping upstairs, dreaming of her own bright future. Mariah felt grateful for this steady anchor in her life. Finally, she stood and walked down the hall toward her bedroom. She slipped beneath the covers, the sheets cool against her skin. She closed her eyes, her mind still buzzed with ideas. for reform, meetings to schedule, and the promise of change. Yet underneath it all was a deep, calm knowing she had faced unfairness, stood her ground, and turned that moment into a chance to help others. In the quiet darkness, Mariah whispered a hope to the night that tomorrow would be a day of understanding, action, and healing, and that every person stopped unjustly would one day see a system transformed by fairness and respect. With that thought, she drifted into sleep, ready for the work ahead. A few weeks after the arrest, Mariah Thompson walked into the police headquarters with a calm purpose. The morning light streamed through the glass doors, painting warm patterns on the floor. She paused by the reception desk, where a young officer greeted her with a respectful nod. Today was the meeting she had arranged with Chief Daniels, a chance to turn a painful moment into real change. Chief Daniels stood in his office, tall and steady behind a tidy desk. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming. He rose as Mariah entered and offered her a firm handshake. "Congresswoman Thompson," he said, voice sincere. "Thank you for coming." Mariah settled into the visitor's chair, smoothing her skirt. She felt a mixture of hope and determination. "Thank you for meeting with me, Chief," she replied. "I believe we can work together to make policing fairer in our community." Daniels leaned back, folding his hands. "I agree," he said. "Your experience showed us where our system failed. I want to listen to your ideas," he gestured to a whiteboard in the corner, already marked with bullet points: training, procedures, oversight. Mariah stood and picked up a marker. She wrote under training: mandatory bias awareness, respectful communication, community engagement. Under procedures, she added: clear stop protocols, always identify reason, body cameras always on. She paused, then wrote under oversight: citizen review panels, regular public reports, feedback channels. Chief Daniels watched thoughtfully. "These are solid points," he said. "Bias awareness is a big one," he thought. "We were fair, but your case proved otherwise." We tapped the board. "Let's plan a training program that includes real stories like yours, so officers understand the impact of assumptions." Mariah nodded. "I can share my own experience in a training video," she offered. "I can connect you with community leaders, so the sessions include diverse voices." She felt a spark of energy as they designed a plan together. Sessions at the precinct, workshops in community centers, role-playing exercises to build empathy. Over the next hour, they mapped out a pilot program. Daniels agreed to fund monthly workshops led by Mariah's office and senior officers. They would record anonymous feedback from participants and publish results online. It would schedule body camera reviews of all traffic stops, looking for areas to improve. The urgent notes filled the board, each one a promise of progress. After the meeting, Mariah drove to the local community center for a youth forum. Teens gathered in folding chairs, some curious, others skeptical. When Mariah stepped to the front, she smiled and spoke in a warm, direct tone. She told her story. Simply, how a routine stop became a moment of fear, and how two officers had changed their approach once they knew who she was. She said everyone deserves a chance to be heard and a chance to learn. The teens listened quietly, and a young man in the front row raised his hand. "Ma'am, what if you weren't famous?" he asked. "What if you were just someone from the neighborhood?" Mariah looked at him and answered honestly. "That's why this work matters," she said, "because most people don't have a platform. We need a system that treats every person with respect, fame or no fame." Afterward, a group of students stayed to talk. They shared stories about their own stops, how they felt scared, confused, ashamed. Mariah and two officers from the pilot program listened and took notes. They promised to include these voices in upcoming workshops. That evening, Mariah felt hopeful. The community was stepping forward to speak, and the police were beginning to listen. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Officers Rodriguez and Mills attended their first bias awareness session. They sat side by side in a small classroom, watching Mariah's recorded words on the screen. For the first time, they heard her fear, her calm resolve, and her call for understanding. After the video, a trainer led a discussion. Rodriguez shifted in his seat, glancing at Mills. "I never saw it that way," he admitted quietly. Mills nodded, rubbing his hand over his badge. I acted too fast, he said. I didn't think about the person, just the stop. Over. The weeks that followed, the two officers took part in role plays and community visits. They learned to ask questions with respect, to explain their actions, and to see each person's humanity first. On one afternoon, they volunteered at a local youth center, tossing a football and talking with kids about school and dreams. Rodriguez found himself laughing more in those hours than he had in years on patrol. Mills smiled freely, picking up on the joy of simple connection. Both officers felt their old assumptions soften, replaced by a growing respect for the people they served. Soon, Mariah and Chief Daniels organized a public town hall at the community center. Chairs filled with neighbors, local leaders, and officers. A long table at the front held water pitchers and microphones. Mariah stepped up to speak first. Her voice was steady, her words simple. Today we celebrate the start of a new partnership between our community and our police, she said. We commit to respect, fairness, and open dialogue. Next, Chief Daniels spoke of the pilot program's progress training sessions completed, procedures updated, feedback submitted. He thanked Mariah for her leadership and promised regular updates. Then he introduced Officers Rodriguez and Mills. The two men stood, uncertain, but found courage as neighbors offered polite applause. They shared honest reflections on what they had learned. Rodriguez said, I saw fear in people's eyes. Today I see trust as something we must earn. Mills added, I understand now that each stop matters. Each moment is a chance to do the right thing. The room filled with applause. Mariah smiled at the officers and then at the audience. Questions followed. How can citizens report concerns? What steps ensure accountability? How will training be funded long-term? Question. Received clear, direct answers. When the town hall ended, neighbors stayed to talk one-on-one. Handshakes and quiet nods passed between police and community members. Mariah felt a swell of pride. This was more than a meeting. It was a bridge being built. A month later, Mariah's office released the first public report on the pilot program. Numbers showed fewer complaints about traffic stops, more positive feedback from community surveys, and higher attendance at workshops. Local news outlets covered the results with cautious optimism. One headline read, New program brings hope for better policing. And another said, Congresswoman and police forge path to trust. Back in Washington, Mariah introduced a bill inspired by her experience. It called for national guidelines on bias training, body camera standards, and community oversight committees. She described her story on the House floor, speaking plainly of handcuffs, mocking words, and the power of a respectful conversation. Members from both parties listened, some nodding in agreement. When the vote came, the bill passed its committee unanimously, and Mariah felt that familiar spark of hope for broader change. Through it all, Mariah returned each evening to her home and to Emma's eager questions. She shared successes, listened to concerns, and reminded herself why she fought for service in the first place. Emma watched her mother with admiration, proud of what they had started together. Mariah knew the road ahead would not be easy. Old habits die hard, and systems need constant care. But she believed in steady progress, in small actions building into larger change. On the anniversary of the incident, Chief Daniels invited Mariah back to the station for a ceremony. A small plaque was unveiled in the training room, reading, In honor of Congresswoman Mariah Thompson and the community partnership that inspires respect, Mariah's, and unity. Mariah's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She shook hands with officers old and new, each one promising to carry forward the lessons learned. As she walked away that evening, she looked back at the station lights glowing softly in the dusk. She felt the weight of what had begun and the promise of what could be. She thought of every person whose life might be a little safer, a little more dignified because of one moment of courage. And she whispered to herself, We are stronger together. With that thought, Mariah stepped into her car, the road stretching before her like possibilities. She started the engine gently and drove toward home, confident that respect and understanding would always guide the journey ahead.